History is set in stone. Of course, memories are often inaccurate and one person's version of the past may differ from another's. But what actually happened can't be changed. The truth will always be the truth. Generally, people try to document important events in order to remember them as accurately as possible, using the testimony to remember good deeds and learn from mistakes. Sometimes, though, the Empire wants you to believe they never made any mistakes at all. It's often said that behind every great conquering nation is a trail of bodies and blood, and that was no different when it came to the rules of the British Empire between the 16th and 20th centuries. As time went on and their era of domination over the world began to collapse, concerns began to grow about how much information related to the darker aspects of what they'd done were going to get out to the public. So, in order to ensure the reputation of Great Britain remained as strong as possible, a plan was hatched to make sure any evidence of wrongdoing was squashed, particularly those that highlighted examples of racial or religious bias on behalf of the government. Unfortunately, though, such a plan would eventually be revealed to the world anyway, and as a result, the people of Britain were forced to contend with one of the darker parts of their legacy. By the time World War II ended in 1945, the UK was in dire straits as the money they'd been forced to pour into winning the conflict had essentially left them bankrupt. In fact, the only reason they avoided insolvency at all was because, a year later in 1946, they were able to negotiate a loan of $4.3 billion from the new superpower of the world, the United States. Interest rates on such a loan were high, and that meant the island nation would be left paying it back for the next several decades. As if that wasn't stressful enough on their already damaged spirit, they also had to contend with the fact that amongst their various colonies around the world, anti-colonial sentiment was growing stronger with each passing day, meaning it felt like only a matter of time until their once great empire collapsed entirely. That was the last thing the leaders of Britain wanted because, with both the US and the Soviet Union now having overtaken them on the world stage in terms of influence, the empire was one of the only jewels left remaining of their crown. That was why they initially fought back against protesters who wanted them to give back sovereignty to any countries they'd conquered over the years as, if they did that, then they feared they'd have nothing left. But for as much as they resisted, it pretty quickly became clear such a tactic was not going to work as by that point too much momentum had been built up for the anti-colonial movement. That was what led to Burma, Sri Lanka, India, and the newly formed Dominion of Pakistan all gaining independence before the decade was over. Though, in the case of the latter two, it only happened after the partition of India led to the deaths of approximately 1 million people and the displacement of a further 18 million. Clearly then, even in doing something that was good in the grand scheme of things, Britain was still causing irreparable damage to the people of their colonies, and given the clear racial reasoning behind India's partition, such damage only felt all the more terrible as a result. So, not wanting any more bad press attached to his homeland's name, then UK Prime Minister Harold McMillan gave a speech in front of a crowd in Cape Town, South Africa in February of 1960 where he spoke of the winds of change currently blowing through the continent. In his own words, when talking about not only the increased desire for independence, but also the growing push for the anti-apartheid movement then making waves across the African country, he stated, quote, "Whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. We are the people who brought civilization to Africa. To do justice in Africa means not only being just to the black man of Africa, but also the white man of Africa." Now, whether McMillan was sincere about his desire to see desegregation or whether it was just a canny way for him to gain favor amongst the local black populace is up for debate. Whatever the truth, The reality was that speech also served the dual purpose of being one of the earliest on-record acknowledgments that the time of the empire truly was coming to a close. So it should come as no surprise that as the years went on, more and more countries once under British rule fought for and ultimately gained their own independence. And as an unintended consequence of that, a whole host of documents that showed the less than savory behavior of the empire towards their now former territories was suddenly at risk of being revealed to the world as the new leaders began the process of declassification. Obviously then, that wasn't something the UK government was happy with, as they wanted to maintain the myth they'd been a benign and caring force when compared to other imperial powers of the time. If it was disclosed that they had been directly involved in the elimination of political enemies in Malaya, however, or that they'd allowed for torture to take place inside Kenyan concentration camps, then that myth would quickly collapse. But what could be done about it? After all, it wasn't as if British military leaders could just go to these newly installed heads of state and ask them to hand over such documents without risking them being read first. That would just be asking for trouble. If they did such a thing, then it would only increase the likelihood such information would be leaked to the larger world. No, the only solution to the problem was to get rid of any incriminating evidence by means of subterfuge. And it was that realization that led to the birth of Operation Legacy not long after. While it is known that Operation Legacy first came into being somewhere around the 1950s, in true espionage fashion, its exact origin point remains unclear. In fact, the information relating to it is so muddy that it's not even clear who it was that gave the initial go-ahead to start the whole undertaking. Sure, it might seem easier to assume the plans were developed either in the halls of Parliament back in London, or more quietly at somewhere like MI5, but according to various different people who've researched the topic over the years, that may not be exactly true. No, it appears that rather than be created by a single group of elected officials or military leaders during a series of formal meetings, such a plan was gradually brought into being by those out in the trenches of the colonies themselves, with the plan only being made formal after the fact. As Mandy Banton, a leading expert on Operation Legacy, put it herself when later asked, quote, "It seems quite possible that formal policy was first drawn up for Gold Coast, which achieved independence in 1957, although the Ceylon example must not be forgotten." What was the Ceylon example? Well, that refers to an event that took place back in 1948 when Ceylon gained independence and in the process renamed themselves Sri Lanka. Of course, with that being the first British colony to break free of their master's grasp, there was always going to be some difficulties transferring power over in a smooth manner. Those difficulties even spread to things like who should have access to previous records that had been kept by the British government with regards to the Asian country, something then Governor of Sri Lanka, Henry Moore, felt belonged to his people. But while he may have believed that, given the sensitive nature of some of what the British had been doing while in control of Ceylon, they were understandably hesitant to hand any such documents over. Sure, there wasn't anything outright immoral or illegal that had taken place during their rule there, but it was understood by all that such a decision would set a precedent when other countries made similar requests in the future, countries where more unsavory decision-making may have been taking place. So that was why, after a lengthy period of internal discussion, it was determined that no files would be released at that point, and that they should instead be either sent back home to the UK or destroyed outright. Of course, given the fact that they'd eventually be handed over to the Department of National Archives in Sri Lanka in the decades that followed, they obviously weren't destroyed. But even if that was the case in this particular instance, the idea of doing so had clearly now entered into the ether. That meant, when other countries such as Kenya, Malta, or Ghana filed similar requests once they achieved their own independence, such a practice would be carried out, with many of the files removed during those periods being burnt to a crisp so there was no hope anyone would ever be able to read them. In fact, by the time Ghana was on the verge of achieving independence in 1956, the practice of removing potentially incriminating files by any means necessary was about to become fully formalized. Sure, neither the general public nor the Ghanaian leaders were aware of that, but those in the British Colonial Office most certainly were because, on May 29th of that year, the Governor's Office of the Gold Coast, the last remaining vestige of British rule in the soon-to-be renamed Ghana, informed their peers back home that they were setting up a committee in order to begin the scrutiny of security records. What were they looking to find while scouring through these records? Well, unsurprisingly, that would include information that might embarrass either the UK government or the Gold Coast Police had it come to light. And so, over the course of one committee hearing where it was decided sensitive documents would have to be destroyed before any handover process began, the thing that had been bubbling up for years was finally codified as Operation Legacy. And now that it was codified, Operation Legacy was allowed to run rampant without any oversight or penalty over the next decade and a half, right at the point that decolonization of the British Empire was reaching its peak. So commonplace was its usage amongst the colonies, in fact. In 1961, written instructions were issued from Colonial Secretary Ian MacLeod to all of those who might find it of use. Those instructions read, quote, "Post-independence government should not be handed any material that might embarrass Her Majesty's government, that could embarrass members of the police, military forces, public servants, or others. For example, police informers that might betray intelligence sources or that might be used unethically by ministers in the successor government." Of course, as mentioned earlier, it wasn't just a case of removing those documents from the vicinity of potentially prying eyes by sending them back over to the UK, though. No, on a number of occasions, such files were completely destroyed by means of burning them. That's exactly what happened in North Rhodesia, the land which is today known as Zimbabwe. The reason those files had to be quickly disposed of was because there were concerns they might prove the British had shown a racial prejudice when it came to the way they dealt with the locals, and Rhodesia was far from the only example of a British colony that had suffered the effects of racial prejudice. In fact, an arguably even greater example of that had taken place in Uganda at around the same time as it was there, after requesting access to information being held by the Colonial Office while working at the security registry. A woman since recorded as Mrs. O.E. De Souza was denied the request. While Mrs. De Souza was a genuine employee of said department, meaning she should have been able to access the aforementioned information whenever it was requested, the fact that she was a woman of color originally from Goa, India, made her untrustworthy in the eyes of those in power. As far as they saw it, someone like her simply couldn't be trusted with anything the Colonial Office had on file, whether it be sensitive or entirely unremarkable in its nature. And that's even taking into account the fact Mrs. De Souza was actually British herself, with her having married a naturalized UK citizen in 1938 and subsequently signing a declaration of acquisition of British nationality, meaning she was legally supposed to be treated the same as any other UK citizen. Clearly then, the only reason for not giving her the document she had asked for was because she was a foreigner at birth. Officials at the governor's office pretty much said as much when they stated they didn't question Mrs. De Souza's loyalty or discretion, but that regardless of that, she shouldn't be authorized to see such things. As if that wasn't damning enough, just a few months after that, as if in direct response to what took place with De Souza, a further letter was written up and sent out to everyone at the same office that stated, quote, "On no account should any personal communication be shown to any African, to a person of another nationality other than British, or to a non-official." Yes, in what was no doubt a shocker to no one, a primarily white conquering nation was prone to acting in a racially discriminatory way towards a country of minorities they believed they were genetically superior to. And as later revealed documents would show, the same thing was happening in pretty much all of the colonies as well, with Kenya and Malaysia being two other particularly bad examples. But while such a fact wasn't exactly big news to anyone who was paying attention, it still wasn't information the Brits wanted out there in a formally documented manner. So that was why it was particularly important such documents had to go, with even the ashes of the documents to be broken up after the fact so that there was no possible way they could ever be reconstructed. And of those that weren't being burned but were being offloaded at sea instead, Well, they were, as per the instructions of Colonial Secretary Ian MacLeod, to be packed in weighted crates and dumped into very deep current-free water at a maximum practical distance from the coast, making it as close to impossible as could be that no one would ever find them. That's not to say all potentially sensitive files were outright destroyed at the time, though. No, despite the burning and burial at sea of reams of paperwork, there were still large amounts that were sent back to the UK where they were to be held under strict lock and key in the Foreign Office archives. What was the difference about those documents that merited them not being torn apart at the very scene of the crime? Well, it appears they either weren't quite as damning to Britain's reputation as a benevolent world leader as others were, or they contained information within them that demanded they be kept intact, albeit while being kept under careful watch at all times, of course. The latter explanation is even backed up by the words of Robert Turner, then Chief Secretary of the British Protectorate of North Borneo, who in August of 1963 wrote a letter to the Colonial Office Library which stated, quote, "Subordinates' monthly reports, which would be unsuitable for the eyes of local ministers, should be saved and sent to London rather than destroyed. I have been prevailed to do so on the grounds that at least some of their contents may come in handy when some future Gibbon is doing research work for his Decline and Fall of the British Empire." That said, in contrast to the words of Turner, once those particular documents made their way back onto UK soil, they wouldn't be made available to historians who might be able to use them for research purposes. No, like every other document that was shipped over from the colonies, they'd be hidden away for decades, all in the hopes they never see the light of day again. Those documents were kept so secret that even after 30 years passed and they were legally required to be made available to the general public as per the Public Records Act, decision-makers still didn't follow up on it. Rather, that wouldn't happen until a later date when their hands were finally forced. Given the length the Brits were willing to go in order to make sure the information never saw the light of day, the question remains: what exactly happened to cause it all to be unveiled? Well, the answer to that can be found in what took place in 2011 when one seemingly innocuous historian named David Anderson inadvertently brought the whole house of cards tumbling down. While visiting the Kenyan National Archive to research a book he was writing entitled Histories of the Hanged, Britain's Dirty War in Kenya and the End of the Empire, he noticed that a number of documents that should have been there were missing. So, immediately feeling like a mistake had been made somewhere, he contacted the British Foreign Office and asked if they had any idea what had happened to said files. Needless to say then, British authorities began squirming at that point as they knew exactly where the missing information was, and that they also had no legal remit to hold it secret anymore. And to make matters worse, they also realized if they told the truth about it being in their possession now, they'd be admitting to telling lies when asked about the same topic by the High Court some years prior. So, caught between a rock and a hard place, they decided the best thing to do was to stop the web of lies going any deeper and just admit to their mistakes there and then. That was how around 8,000 previously secret documents would gradually be released over the next few years, with each providing more information than the last about the various immoral acts the UK government had been involved in throughout the time of the British Empire, whether it be the covert approval of concentration camps and assassination efforts carried out against political enemies or just plain racist prejudice held against the citizens of the colonies. It was all now on show for the world to see. Obviously then, once that information came to light, the affected nations began demanding reparations in the form of both apologies and financial compensation, the latter of which would happen soon after when payouts were made to Kenyan natives who had been tortured, sexually assaulted, and even castrated by British forces during the Mau Mau insurgency of the 1950s that helped to bring about Kenyan independence. While the UK was willing to part with some money if it meant making things right again, one thing they weren't willing to do was offer a formal apology. Sure, the Foreign Office would express regret over any wrongdoings they had involvement in, but for both the survivors and the families of the deceased, that simply wasn't enough. So, is the lesson that conquering nations can commit all sorts of atrocities and ultimately walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist? Sadly, that seems to be the case in this particular situation. Still, at least the documents in question are now all on display at a public archive at Hanslope Park, Buckinghamshire, so it's not as if they're hidden any longer. And with people able to access them whenever they want now, seeing exactly what the British Empire did when it was at its worst in the process, maybe it will serve as a reminder that we all have to hold ourselves to a higher standard in the future, and not just be content to remember history the way we want it to be. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.